Imagine for a moment that time itself could be pulled backward, not by years or centuries, but by tens of thousands of years, until you find yourself standing in East Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, watching a group of humans, your ancestors, gathering at the edge of a decision they don't fully understand. And what makes this moment unsettling is that they don't look primitive or different or distant from you. They look exactly like you in every meaningful way, with the same brain size, the same ability to imagine things that don't exist yet, the same capacity for language, for memory, for planning, for fear, for curiosity, for everything that makes you human today. Now hold that image in your mind and change just one variable, because instead of letting that group stay together, you divide them. You let one part remain in Africa, you let another move north into Europe, you let a third drift into Asia, and over generations you allow others to keep moving further, crossing land bridges into the Americas, reaching Australia, slowly spreading across the planet without realizing that this single moment will fracture the human story into completely different trajectories. Then press forward, not a little, but all the way to the year 1500. And now look again, because what you see should not make sense at first glance, since those same humans who began with the same biological potential are now living in societies that barely resemble one another, where in parts of Europe you find steel weapons, ocean-crossing ships, written systems that preserve knowledge across generations, and empires expanding outward with relentless force, while in other parts of the world, large areas of sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, Australia, you find societies still relying on stone tools, some without writing, others without domesticated large animals, many without dense cities as you would recognize them. Same species, same starting point, completely different outcomes. And this is where the question stops being casual curiosity and starts becoming something heavier, something that presses against your mind and refuses to let go, because you're forced to ask yourself why populations that were equally capable, equally intelligent, equally human, ended up diverging so dramatically, why gunpowder appeared in China, why the scientific revolution ignited in Europe, why indigenous populations in the Americas were devastated by diseases brought by Europeans while the reverse almost never happened, and why, even on the surface, human beings from different parts of the world look physically different at all. But before you go any further, you have to face something uncomfortable, because this question is not new, and for centuries people tried to answer it in the worst possible way, building entire systems of belief around it, using it to justify slavery, colonialism, and genocide, inventing pseudoscientific theories that claimed some groups were inherently superior to others, that Europeans were somehow more intelligent, more capable, more destined to rule, and none of that was ever true, not even close, because those explanations were never about truth. They were about power, about creating comfortable lies that made unjustifiable actions feel acceptable. And yet, refusing to ask the question doesn't make it disappear, because the differences were real, the advantages were real. A European soldier carrying steel weapons and smallpox really did have overwhelming power over an Incan warrior regardless of how intelligent or brave that warrior was. So the real question isn't whether these differences existed, it's why they existed. And the answer, the real answer, has nothing to do with intelligence or superiority or destiny. It has everything to do with something far more ordinary and far more powerful at the same time, which is the land itself, the environment, the geography beneath people's feet. Because what scientists have uncovered over the past few decades changes everything about how you understand history, since it shows that it wasn't genes or culture or some vague idea of civilizational greatness that shaped these outcomes. It was geography, the shape of continents, the plants available for domestication, the animals that could or could not be tamed, the diseases that evolved in different regions, all of it driven by randomness, by chance, by circumstances no human being chose, and sometimes by pure bad luck. And if you're listening to this right now, lying in bed, letting your mind drift slowly while the story unfolds, that's exactly how it's meant to be experienced, because this isn't just information, it's a perspective shift, and maybe you pause for a moment, maybe you leave a comment telling where you are and what time it is, because there's something strangely powerful about knowing that people in Berlin at sunrise, in Tokyo at midnight, in Chicago just before sleep are all listening to the same story at the same time, all connected through this invisible thread of shared human history. Because what you're about to explore isn't just a sequence of events, it's the hidden structure underneath everything you think you know, the framework that explains why Europe colonized Africa instead of the other way around, why diseases spread the way they did, why certain physical traits developed in certain regions, and it does all of that without relying on any myth of superior or inferior people. In fact, replacing those myths with something far more complex and far more fascinating. It's a story about the direction continents stretch across the planet, about animals that refuse to be domesticated no matter how much humans try, about the difference between crops like wheat and crops like yams, about climates that quietly shaped immune systems and skin color over thousands of years, about how small environmental details that seem insignificant, can cascade into massive historical consequences, where the orientation of a continent determines how quickly ideas spread, where the presence or absence of a single animal can shift the entire trajectory of civilization. And what makes this story powerful isn't just that it explains the past, it's that it explains the present, why some regions are wealthy while others are not, why global inequality exists, why your ancestors look the way they did, why you look the way you do, and most importantly, it reveals something deeper about human nature itself. Because when you remove geography from the equation, when you account for environmental differences, the idea of superior and inferior groups collapses completely, because there were never superior people, only different circumstances. What looked like superiority was actually geography shaping outcomes. Europeans weren't inherently smarter than Africans or Native Americans. They just happened to live in environments where certain advantages accumulated over time, and if you pause for a second and really think about that, it changes everything, because the story you've been told about why the world looks the way it does is mostly wrong, while the real explanation has been sitting in plain sight for thousands of years, written into landscapes, climates, and ecosystems. And over the next few hours, piece by piece, that hidden structure will unfold, starting where everything began in Africa, moving through the environments that shaped different populations, examining why some regions gave their inhabitants advantages, while others imposed limitations, exploring questions that sound simple but carry enormous consequences, like why you can ride a horse but not a zebra, and why that matters more than you would ever expect, how diseases shaped empires, how climate shaped bodies, how small differences compounded over time. By the end, you won't see history as a story of better or worse people, but as a story of chance, environment, and the accumulation of small advantages over vast stretches of time, because the question that changes everything isn't who was better, it's what was different about where they lived. And to understand that, you have to go even further back, Because here is something that completely reshapes how you think about human origins. Every single person watching this right now, no matter where you're from, has ancestors who lived in Africa, not some of them, all of them. And this isn't speculation or theory, it's written directly into your DNA, because around 300,000 years ago, the species we call Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, not in one isolated place, but across multiple populations spread throughout the continent, with fossils from Morocco, Ethiopia, and South Africa, all pointing to roughly the same period. From the very beginning, humanity wasn't a single small group, it was already diverse, already spread out, already adapting to different environments within Africa itself. And here's what makes that even more interesting. Africa didn't just give birth to humanity, it remained the most genetically diverse place on Earth. Because if you took a small group of people from a single African village and measured their genetic variation, you would likely find more diversity within that group than across entire populations spread through Europe, Asia, and the Americas combined. And that isn't because Africans are fundamentally different, it's because everyone else represents a subset of that original diversity, a smaller branch that left carrying only part of the full genetic range, because for hundreds of thousands of years, Africa was where everything happened, where humans developed the core abilities that define us, where the earliest complex tools appeared, not just random stones, but carefully shaped instruments designed for specific tasks, where the earliest forms of art emerged through pigments, carvings, symbolic objects, where language most likely developed even if it left no direct fossil trace. For 250,000 years, humans in Africa were adapting, innovating, building the mental and cultural toolkit that would later allow them to survive anywhere on the planet, and different groups specialized in different environments, some along coasts, others in grasslands, others in harsh conditions where survival itself required constant innovation. And this diversity created pressure not for narrow specialization, but for flexibility, for the ability to adapt quickly, to change, to solve new problems. That's what makes humans unique. Not that we are perfectly adapted to one environment, but that we are adaptable to many. And that trait was forged in Africa through countless generations of environmental change, shifting climates, droughts, and challenges. And then, around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, something changed. A small group left, not millions, not even thousands, but perhaps just a few hundred individuals who crossed from northeast Africa into the Arabian Peninsula, and no one knows exactly why. Maybe population pressure, maybe climate changes, maybe curiosity, probably a mix of all three. But what matters is that they kept moving. Within a few thousand years, their descendants spread across Asia's coastlines. Within 10,000 years, they reached Australia. By 45,000 years ago, they were entering Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas. But here's the critical detail that changes everything. Most humans never left Africa. This was not a mass migration. It was a small splinter group branching off from a much larger population. And that matters because that group carried only a fraction of human genetic diversity with them. Everything else remained behind. Which is why genetic variation decreases the further you move from Africa, because each new region was settled by smaller groups branching off from previous ones, reducing variation step by step. Meanwhile, in Africa, diversity continued to expand. Populations adapted in multiple directions. Technologies developed. Cultures evolved. Systems changed. Africa didn't remain static. It continued evolving in parallel, holding more variation than anywhere else. But the people who left carried something essential. Not superiority, not advancement, but the full human toolkit. The same cognitive flexibility, the same ability to think, speak, imagine, and adapt. They were not better. They were simply elsewhere, and those new environments were about to shape their descendants in ways no one could have predicted. Because evolution doesn't stop, and as those populations spread into new landscapes, frozen tundras, dense forests, mountains, islands, they encountered challenges completely different from anything their ancestors had faced, and over thousands of generations small physical differences accumulated, skin adapting to sunlight, bodies adapting to temperature, immune systems adapting to local diseases. But beneath all of that, nothing fundamental changed. We remained the same species, carrying the same origin, sharing most of our DNA, still part of one extended human family. So the real question isn't why different populations became different kinds of humans, because they didn't. The real question is why the environments they entered led them down such different paths. And to answer that, we have to look at what came next. Now this is where the story shifts in a way that most people never expect. Because after that moment, after that small group left Africa carrying only a fraction of humanity's total diversity, you would logically assume that every population, no matter where it ended up, would have roughly equal chances of developing complex societies over time, since they all shared the same cognitive abilities, the same capacity for language, the same potential to innovate and adapt. And yet, that's not what happened, not even close. And the reason for that gap, the real reason, has almost nothing to do with the people themselves and everything to do with something they never chose, something they couldn't control, something as simple and as powerful as the land beneath their feet. Picture two individuals for a moment, both equally intelligent, equally disciplined, equally driven, and place one of them on a wide stretch of fertile land with rich soil, predictable rainfall, and rivers that can be navigated easily. Then place the other in a rugged landscape filled with rocky terrain, unstable weather patterns, and no natural routes for transportation or trade. And then leave them there, not for a year or a decade, but for centuries, for millennia, and come back after 1,000 years to see what their descendants have built. Because the answer becomes almost painfully obvious. One environment quietly multiplies effort, while the other constantly resists it. And yet, for most of human history, people didn't see it that way. They looked at the results and assumed the differences must come from the people themselves, from intelligence, from culture, from some imagined hierarchy. So they built theories to explain it. Theories about superiority, about destiny, about inherent differences between groups, when in reality the explanation was much simpler and much more uncomfortable at the same time, because it meant that so much of what happened came down to something as arbitrary as geography. In the late 20th century, a scientist named Jared Diamond noticed something that had always been visible but rarely understood. He looked at a map of the world not as a collection of countries or borders, but as shapes, as patterns, as structures. And he realized that continents don't just differ in size or location, they differ in orientation, in the way they stretch across the planet. And that single detail turns out to have enormous consequences. Because Eurasia, the vast landmass that extends from Portugal all the way to Korea, runs primarily east to west, spreading across similar latitudes, which means similar climates, similar seasons, similar temperatures across enormous distances, while Africa stretches mostly north to south, cutting through radically different climate zones, from Mediterranean environments in the north to deserts, to savannas, to dense tropical rainforests, and finally to temperate regions in the far south. And that difference alone changes everything about how ideas, crops, animals, and technologies move. because latitude determines climate, and climate determines what can grow, what can survive, what can be repeated from one region to another. And when a continent runs east to west, an innovation discovered in one place can travel across thousands of kilometers with relatively little resistance, because the conditions remain similar enough for it to work elsewhere. So if a farmer in ancient Anatolia discovers that wheat grows well in a certain environment, that same crop can often be grown in Greece, in Italy, in parts of China, because the underlying conditions don't change dramatically. But when a continent runs north to south, that same innovation runs into barriers, because a crop that thrives in a Mediterranean climate might completely fail in a tropical rainforest. A farming technique that works in a temperate zone might collapse under extreme heat and humidity. So instead of spreading, each region has to adapt, reinvent, or sometimes abandon the idea entirely and start from zero again. This is what's known as the axis effect, and once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore, because Eurasia effectively functioned as a massive corridor where knowledge could flow, where crops could spread, where animals could be domesticated and then shared across regions, while Africa, by contrast, was fragmented by its own diversity, by deserts that acted as barriers, by climates that shifted dramatically over relatively short distances, forcing each society to solve problems locally instead of benefiting from a continuous chain of shared innovation. Take the Sahara Desert, for example, the largest hot desert on Earth, which cuts across North Africa like a massive wall, not just wide but hostile, constantly shifting, expanding and contracting over time, but always acting as a barrier that made movement difficult and dangerous, because crossing it required specialized knowledge, preparation, and resources that many groups simply didn't have. And even when crossing was possible, it wasn't easy, it wasn't frequent, it wasn't the kind of environment where ideas could flow freely. And even beyond the Sahara, Africa continues to present layers of environmental challenges, because below the desert you find the Sahel, a semi-arid zone with unpredictable rainfall. Then further south you encounter savannas, then dense equatorial rainforests filled with heat, humidity and disease, and then more varied ecosystems beyond that, each with its own conditions, its own limitations, its own rules, meaning that a solution that works in one place might be completely useless in another, just a few hundred kilometers away. Now compare that to a farmer living in ancient Mesopotamia, who develops agriculture based on wheat and barley, because within a relatively short period of time, those same crops spread across the entire Eurasian landmass, from the Middle East into Europe, into parts of Asia, because the conditions allowed it, because the climate didn't force constant reinvention, because the environment supported continuity instead of fragmentation. The same pattern appears with animals, because when horses were domesticated somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, they didn't remain local. They spread across thousands of kilometers, transforming transportation, warfare, agriculture, everything they touched, simply because they could survive across similar climates, because the environment allowed it. Africa had large animals too, but many of them, like zebras, were never domesticated, not because people didn't try, but because the animals themselves were fundamentally different, more aggressive, less suited to domestication, and even if they had been, spreading them across different ecological zones would have been extremely difficult, because what thrives in one region might not survive in another. Then there are rivers, which function as natural highways for civilizations, especially before modern infrastructure, because they allow goods, people, and ideas to move efficiently across large distances, and Eurasia is filled with long navigable rivers, the Danube, the Rhine, the Volga, the Yangtze, the Ganges, creating interconnected systems that supported trade and communication. Africa has rivers too, some of the largest in the world, but many of them are interrupted by waterfalls, rapids, and seasonal changes that make long-distance navigation difficult, meaning that instead of acting as continuous highways, they often become fragmented routes, limiting the movement of goods and ideas. None of this means that development in Africa was impossible, because it wasn't. African societies built complex civilizations, developed agriculture, created trade networks, established kingdoms and empires, but they often had to solve problems locally, independently, without the same level of connectivity that allowed innovations in Eurasia to compound over time. And this is where the concept of isolation becomes important, because isolation can protect, but it can also limit. It can prevent the spread of disease or invasion, but it can also slow down the spread of ideas, because when a breakthrough occurs in one region, its impact depends on how far and how fast it can travel. In Eurasia, innovations moved quickly, spreading across large populations, being refined, improved, adapted, creating a kind of cumulative effect where each advancement built on previous ones across a vast network of interconnected societies. In Africa, innovations often remained localized for longer periods, not because of a lack of intelligence or creativity, but because the environment made it harder for them to spread, meaning that progress occurred, but it accumulated differently, often more slowly, often in parallel rather than in a shared system. Even coastlines played a role, because Europe's coastline is highly irregular, filled with natural harbours, peninsulas and islands that encourage maritime activity, trade and exploration, while much of Africa's coastline is smoother, with fewer natural harbours, making early seafaring more difficult in many regions. And when you step back and look at all of this together, the picture becomes clearer, because what you're seeing isn't a difference in human capability, it's a difference in environmental conditions, a difference in how easily ideas could spread, how efficiently resources could be used, how quickly innovations could compound. It's like two groups playing the same game with the same skills, but on different maps, one where resources flow easily and information spreads quickly, and another where everything requires more effort, more time, more adaptation, and over hundreds and thousands of years, those small differences begin to accumulate, quietly at first, almost invisibly, until they become impossible to ignore. And here's the most important part. The people living through this didn't see it. They didn't know they were in different conditions. They didn't realize that geography was shaping their future. They were simply responding to the world around them, solving the problems in front of them, building their societies step by step, unaware that those steps were being guided by forces they couldn't see. But over time, those invisible forces, geography, climate, environment, created differences in population density, in agricultural output, in technological development, in the ability to support specialized roles within society. Not because one group was better, not because one group was smarter, but because they were standing on different ground. And once you see that, once you truly understand it, everything else starts to make sense. And this is where the story takes another sharp turn, because once you understand that geography shaped how ideas and technologies spread, the next question becomes even more specific, even more concrete, and far more unsettling than most people expect, because it forces you to look at something that seems almost trivial on the surface, animals, and realize that they may have influenced human history more than kings, more than wars, more than entire empires. So imagine two animals standing in front of you. Both are large, both are strong, both move in herds, both have existed for millions of years, and yet one of them, the horse, became one of the most important partners humans have ever had, transforming agriculture, transportation, warfare, and communication across entire continents, while the other, the zebra, despite looking almost identical in many ways, despite living alongside humans for just as long, was never successfully domesticated, not in ancient Egypt, not in the Roman Empire, not even in modern times. And that difference, as strange as it sounds, is not a minor detail. It is a fracture line in human history. Because domestication is not just about having animals, it's about having the right animals. Animals with specific traits, animals that can be controlled, bred, used, scaled across generations, animals that don't just survive alongside humans, but become part of human systems. And when you look closely, something almost absurd appears. Across the entire history of humanity, across all continents, all cultures, all environments, only a tiny number of large mammals were ever successfully domesticated. Not dozens, not hundreds, 14. Out of all the large animal species humans encountered, only 14 made the cut. And here's where it becomes even more uneven. 13 of those 14 existed in Eurasia. One existed in South America. Africa, the continent with some of the most powerful, diverse and impressive wildlife on Earth, contributed none. 0. And that wasn't because people in Africa didn't try, because they did for thousands of years, repeatedly, persistently, but the animals themselves simply weren't suitable. Because for an animal to be domesticated, it needs a very specific combination of traits. It needs to have a flexible diet so it doesn't compete directly with humans. It needs to reproduce in captivity. It needs to grow relatively quickly so it becomes useful within a human lifetime. It needs a temperament that can be shaped over generations. And most importantly, it needs a social structure with clear hierarchies that humans can exploit. Horses had that. Cattle had that. Sheep, goats, pigs, all of them had it. Control the dominant individual and the rest follow. That simple mechanism allowed humans to scale control, to turn animals into systems. But zebras didn't have it. They looked like horses, but behaved completely differently. Their social structures were loose. Their aggression didn't decrease with age. Their flight response was extreme and unpredictable. And even when humans raised them from birth, they remained dangerous, resistant, impossible to fully integrate into human systems. And this wasn't a coincidence. It was evolution. Because African animals had been living alongside humans for millions of years, meaning they had time to adapt to us, to recognize us as predators, to evolve behaviors that made them harder to control, harder to approach, harder to dominate. The animals that survived were the ones that ran faster, fought harder, resisted more. Natural selection shaped them to avoid exactly the kind of relationship domestication requires. Eurasian animals didn't have that history. Humans arrived there much later, and those animals hadn't evolved alongside human hunters for the same extended period, which meant they were, in a sense, naive, less adapted to resist human control, more susceptible to domestication. And that difference created something enormous. Because once you domesticate animals, everything changes. A farmer using an ox-drawn plough can cultivate vastly more land than a farmer working by hand, which means more food, more surplus, more stability, and that surplus becomes the foundation of everything else. Because once you produce more food than you need to survive, not everyone has to farm anymore, and that's when societies begin to transform. because now you can support people who don't produce food directly. Craftsmen, soldiers, administrators, inventors, priests, thinkers. And once those roles exist, knowledge begins to accumulate, systems become more complex, innovation accelerates, and what started as a simple agricultural advantage become a cascade of development. But without domesticated animals, that process slows down. Agriculture remains more labor-intensive. Transportation becomes more difficult. Trade networks remain smaller. Warfare remains limited in scale. Every step requires more human effort, more time, more energy. And that difference compounds. But the impact of domesticated animals didn't stop at agriculture or transportation. It extended into something far more dangerous: disease. Because every domesticated animal carries pathogens, viruses, bacteria that can jump from animals to humans, and over thousands of years, populations that live in close proximity to these animals are constantly exposed to those diseases. Most people die, but some survive, and those survivors pass on resistance. Generation after generation, populations develop partial immunity to diseases that originally came from animals. Diseases like measles, influenza, tuberculosis, many of them originated from domesticated animals. And this created something invisible but incredibly powerful. Populations that had lived with domesticated animals for thousands of years became, in a sense, biologically prepared for those diseases. They still suffered from them, but they survived them. Other populations, those without large domesticated animals, never went through that process. They were never exposed. They never developed resistance. And when contact finally happened between these groups, the consequences were catastrophic. Because what looked like simple illness to one group became devastation to another. Diseases that Europeans survived as children wiped out entire populations in the Americas before large-scale conflict even began. And this is where the advantage becomes almost terrifying. Because it wasn't just about weapons or technology. It was about biology. It was about populations unintentionally carrying diseases into environments where no one had immunity. And that changed the balance of power before any battle was fought. But even beyond disease, the absence of domesticated animals created structural limitations. Without animals for transport, moving goods required human labor. Without animals for ploughing, agriculture remained limited in scale. Without animals for warfare, military systems developed differently. And again, none of this was about intelligence. None of this was about effort. It was about resources. It was about which animals happened to exist in which environments, and whether those animals could be integrated into human systems. And what makes this even more striking is how much of history can be traced back to something that seems so small. Not great leaders, not brilliant inventions, but the simple fact that some continents had animals that could be domesticated, and others didn't. Because once that advantage existed, it didn't stay small. It multiplied. It spread. It compounded over time, creating two different paths. In one, animals powered agriculture, transport and warfare, enabling surplus, specialization, and rapid innovation. In the other, humans adapted brilliantly to their environment, developed complex societies, built systems that worked within their constraints, but did so with fewer tools, with more effort, with slower accumulation, not worse, not inferior, just different conditions, different constraints, different outcomes. And when those two worlds eventually collided after thousands of years of separate development, the gap that had formed was no longer small. It was enormous, not because one group of humans had become something else, but because for 10,000 years they had been working with different partners, different animals, different possibilities, and those differences shaped everything that came after. And just when you think the story has already explained enough, geography, animals, the spread of ideas, another layer emerges, one that is less visible, but even more relentless, because it operates silently, constantly, across entire populations without asking for permission, and that layer is climate and disease, the twin forces that shaped not only how societies grew, but whether they could grow at all. Because imagine living in a place where survival itself demands more from your body every single day, where the environment is not just something you adapt to, but something that actively works against you, where the conditions that surround you quietly limit how much food you can produce, how long you can store it, how much energy you can expend, and how many people survive long enough to contribute to society. Start with climate. Because climate is not just temperature, it's not just whether it feels hot or cold, it's a system that determines everything from soil fertility to disease spread to human energy levels. And when you compare regions like Europe to large parts of tropical Africa, the difference is not subtle, it is structural. In much of Europe, especially across temperate zones, you have a pattern that repeats itself reliably. 4 seasons, predictable rainfall, winters cold enough to slow down the spread of insects and pathogens, but not so extreme that agriculture becomes impossible, and summers warm enough to support consistent crop growth without pushing the human body to its limits. Now shift to large parts of tropical Africa, where the climate operates on a completely different level, where heat is constant rather than seasonal, where humidity can climb to overwhelming levels, where temperatures regularly push beyond what the human body can comfortably sustain for long periods of work. And suddenly the environment is not just a background condition, it becomes a continuous constraint. Because this changes agriculture immediately, not in theory, but in practice. Because one of the most counterintuitive realities about tropical environments is that the soil, despite the lush vegetation, is often poor for long-term farming, because the same heat and rainfall that allow plants to grow quickly also strip nutrients out of the soil at an equally fast rate, washing them away before they can accumulate, leaving behind thin layers of fertility over harder, less productive ground. In temperate regions, the process works differently because colder seasons slow decomposition, allowing organic material to build up gradually, creating deep, nutrient-rich soil that can be farmed year after year, sometimes for generations, sometimes for centuries, with the right management. But in many tropical environments, that stability doesn't exist. You plant, you harvest, maybe once, maybe twice, and then the soil is exhausted, forcing you to move, to clear new land, to repeat the process, turning agriculture into something shifting, something extensive rather than intensive, something that requires more land per person and limits how densely populations can concentrate. And that leads directly into the next constraint: food storage. Because producing food is only part of the equation. Storing it is what allows civilizations to expand. In temperate climates, harvested crops can be stored for long periods because cooler, drier conditions slow down decay, allowing grain to sit in granaries for months, sometimes years, creating reserves that support populations through bad seasons, that allow surplus to accumulate, that feed people who are not farmers. But in hot, humid environments, that same storage becomes a constant battle, because heat accelerates spoilage, moisture invites mold, insects multiply rapidly, and food that could sustain a population over time begins to degrade almost immediately, forcing societies to consume what they produce more quickly, limiting the ability to build large reserves. And without large reserves, you cannot easily support large numbers of people who do not produce food directly, which means fewer specialists, fewer administrators, fewer full-time craftsmen, fewer soldiers, and once again, the difference compounds. But the environment isn't finished yet, because beyond agriculture and storage, there is the physical cost of living itself. Because maintaining a stable body temperature in high heat requires constant effort, and that effort consumes energy. Because sweating, increased heart rate, and thermoregulation all demand calories, meaning that people living in hot climates require more energy just to sustain basic functions, leaving less available for intensive labour. And that matters. Because when your margin between survival and exhaustion is smaller, your ability to push beyond subsistence is reduced, not because of lack of will, not because of lack of intelligence, but because the environment is constantly taxing your body. And just when you think the story has already explained enough, geography, animals, the spread of ideas, another layer emerges, one that is less visible, but even more relentless, because it operates silently, constantly, across entire populations without asking for permission, and that layer is climate and disease, the twin forces that shaped not only how societies grew, but whether they could grow at all. Because imagine living in a place where survival itself demands more from your body every single day, where the environment is not just something you adapt to, but something that actively works against you, where the conditions that surround you quietly limit how much food you can produce, how long you can store it, how much energy you can expend, and how many people survive long enough to contribute to society. Start with climate. Because climate is not just temperature, it's not just whether it feels hot or cold, it's a system that determines everything from soil fertility to disease spread to human energy levels. And when you compare regions like Europe to large parts of tropical Africa, the difference is not subtle, it is structural. In much of Europe, especially across temperate zones, you have a pattern that repeats itself reliably. 4 seasons, predictable rainfall, winters cold enough to slow down the spread of insects and pathogens, but not so extreme that agriculture becomes impossible, and summers warm enough to support consistent crop growth without pushing the human body to its limits. Now shift to large parts of tropical Africa, where the climate operates on a completely different level, where heat is constant rather than seasonal, where humidity can climb to overwhelming levels, where temperatures regularly push beyond what the human body can comfortably sustain for long periods of work. And suddenly the environment is not just a background condition, it becomes a continuous constraint. Because this changes agriculture immediately, not in theory, but in practice. Because one of the most counterintuitive realities about tropical environments is that the soil, despite the lush vegetation, is often poor for long-term farming, because the same heat and rainfall that allow plants to grow quickly also strip nutrients out of the soil at an equally fast rate, washing them away before they can accumulate, leaving behind thin layers of fertility over harder, less productive ground. In temperate regions, the process works differently because colder seasons slow decomposition, allowing organic material to build up gradually, creating deep, nutrient-rich soil that can be farmed year after year, sometimes for generations, sometimes for centuries, with the right management. But in many tropical environments, that stability doesn't exist. You plant, you harvest, maybe once, maybe twice, and then the soil is exhausted, forcing you to move, to clear new land, to repeat the process, turning agriculture into something shifting, something extensive rather than intensive, something that requires more land per person and limits how densely populations can concentrate. And that leads directly into the next constraint: food storage. Because producing food is only part of the equation. Storing it is what allows civilizations to expand. In temperate climates, harvested crops can be stored for long periods because cooler, drier conditions slow down decay, allowing grain to sit in granaries for months, sometimes years, creating reserves that support populations through bad seasons, that allow surplus to accumulate, that feed people who are not farmers. But in hot, humid environments, that same storage becomes a constant battle, because heat accelerates spoilage, moisture invites mold, insects multiply rapidly, and food that could sustain a population over time begins to degrade almost immediately, forcing societies to consume what they produce more quickly, limiting the ability to build large reserves. And without large reserves, you cannot easily support large numbers of people who do not produce food directly, which means fewer specialists, fewer administrators, fewer full-time craftsmen, fewer soldiers, and once again, the difference compounds. But the environment isn't finished yet, because beyond agriculture and storage, there is the physical cost of living itself. Because maintaining a stable body temperature in high heat requires constant effort, and that effort consumes energy. Because sweating, increased heart rate, and thermoregulation all demand calories, meaning that people living in hot climates require more energy just to sustain basic functions, leaving less available for intensive labor. And that matters. Because when your margin between survival and exhaustion is smaller, your ability to push beyond subsistence is reduced, not because of lack of will, not because of lack of intelligence, but because the environment is constantly taxing your body, forces they never chose. And just when it feels like we've traced the major forces, geography, animals, climate, disease, down to their roots, the story tightens again around something even more specific, something quieter, almost invisible at first, but just as decisive in shaping the direction of entire civilizations, and that is agriculture itself. Not the idea of farming, but the exact crops that different human populations happen to domesticate, because this is where the difference between surviving and scaling begins to crystallize in a way that is impossible to ignore. So picture yourself standing 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria toward the Mediterranean. And imagine that you are part of a small community of hunter-gatherers beginning to consider a radical shift. The idea of settling down, of planting seeds, of staying in one place instead of moving constantly in search of food. And now look at what is growing around you, because what you find is almost unbelievably convenient. Wild wheat, wild barley, lentils, chickpeas, peas, plants that are not just edible, but almost perfectly suited for domestication. Because these plants share a combination of traits that, taken together, create something like a shortcut to agriculture, their seeds are large and packed with calories, they grow relatively quickly, they reproduce in predictable cycles, and most importantly, they are self-pollinating annuals, meaning you can plant them, harvest them, and store their seeds without needing complex systems or long waiting periods. And those seeds can be kept for months, sometimes years, without rotting, without losing their value, turning them into a form of stored energy that can be accumulated over time. And this is not a small advantage. This is foundational, because when your primary crops allow you to produce more food than you immediately need, and to store that food reliably, you create something that changes everything: surplus. And surplus is not just extra food, it is freedom from constant subsistence. It is the ability to support people who are not directly involved in food production. It is the foundation upon which complexity is built. Now shift the scene. Move south into sub-Saharan Africa during roughly the same period, where different populations are also transitioning toward agriculture, also experimenting with cultivation, also reshaping their relationship with the land. But now look at what is available to them because the crops are completely different. Sorghum, pearl millet, African rice, yams, teff, plants that are incredibly well adapted to their environments, resilient in the face of drought, capable of surviving conditions that would destroy wheat, nutritionally valuable, but carrying a different set of constraints. Take sorghum, for example, a plant that thrives where rainfall is unpredictable, that can survive harsh conditions, that produces grain that can sustain communities, but whose wild form is difficult to harvest because the seeds scatter easily, making systematic collection challenging, and whose domestication required selecting for multiple traits over long periods, a process that took far more time and effort compared to crops like wheat. Or consider yams, which provide substantial calories and can support populations effectively, but do not store in the same way as grains, because instead of being dry seeds that can sit in storage for long periods, they are living tubers that spoil, sprout, or degrade over time, limiting how much surplus can be accumulated and how far it can be transported. And this difference, this simple difference in how food behaves after it is harvested, has enormous consequences. Because when you can store food easily, you can stabilize populations, you can survive bad seasons, you can support non-farming roles, you can build cities, you can maintain armies, you can develop systems that depend on continuity and planning. But when storage is limited, when food must be consumed relatively quickly, when production is more labor-intensive and less predictable, those same structures become harder to sustain, not impossible, but constrained. And this is where the concept of specialization becomes critical, because once a society produces consistent surplus, not everyone needs to farm, and that allows the emergence of individuals who focus entirely on other roles: metalworkers, builders, administrators, traders, thinkers, people whose full-time effort goes into advancing specific domains. And when those individuals exist in sufficient numbers, knowledge begins to accumulate, systems become more complex, innovation accelerates. In regions like the Fertile Crescent, this process unfolded relatively quickly, because the agricultural base supported it. Within a few thousand years, you see the rise of cities, not just settlements, but dense populations where many people never planted a single crop, supported by the output of farmers who produced more than they needed. And those cities became engines of innovation, because when people with different skills and knowledge interact closely, ideas combine, evolve, build upon one another, creating a compounding effect where each generation inherits not just tools, but systems, not just knowledge, but methods of expanding knowledge. Now return to Africa. Agriculture developed there as well, independently, across multiple regions, with different crops suited to different environments. The Sahel with sorghum and millet, West Africa with yams and rice, the Ethiopian highlands with teff. Each system adapted to local conditions, each representing a genuine agricultural revolution, but the scale and nature of surplus differed, because when crops are harder to store, when yields are less predictable, when labor demands are higher, the margin for surplus shrinks, and with it, the capacity to support large numbers of specialists shrinks as well, meaning that complexity still emerges, but at a different pace, in different forms, often later, often more localized. And then geography intervenes again. Because agriculture does not spread evenly across the globe, it moves most easily across regions with similar climates, which often align along lines of latitude, meaning east-west movement, and this once again gives Eurasia an advantage, because crops domesticated in one part of the continent can often be adopted elsewhere with minimal adaptation. But in Africa, with its north-south orientation, moving crops from one region to another often means crossing into completely different ecological zones, requiring significant adaptation or even entirely new domestication processes, slowing the spread of agricultural innovations. And once again, the effect compounds, because slower spread means slower accumulation. Slower accumulation means fewer shared innovations. Fewer shared innovations mean more localized development. And all of this unfolds over thousands of years, layer upon layer, constraint upon constraint, not stopping progress but shaping its direction. And when you step back and look at the broader pattern, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. It was not intelligence that determined outcomes. It was not effort. It was not ambition. It was the interaction between humans and the specific plants they happened to encounter, the crops they could domesticate, the way those crops behaved, the way they stored, the way they scaled. Because different crops create different possibilities. Different possibilities create different systems, and those systems over time create different trajectories, not better, not worse, but fundamentally different. And those differences did not stay small. And once agriculture had taken root in different forms across different regions, once humans had learned to produce food instead of simply finding it, the story didn't stabilize the way you might expect. It didn't converge into one shared path toward complexity. Instead, it began to split again, because what followed agriculture was not one universal outcome, but multiple directions, multiple experiments in how societies organize themselves, and those experiments were shaped once again by the same forces: geography, climate, population, and the quiet pressure of survival. Because at some point every farming society faces the same question, even if it's never spoken out loud. How do we organize ourselves now that we're no longer just small groups moving across the land? How do we manage surplus? How do we resolve conflict? How do we coordinate large numbers of people? How do we build something that lasts beyond a single generation? And the answers to those questions did not look the same everywhere. In some regions, especially across parts of Eurasia, the conditions favored the emergence of large, centralized states, systems where power concentrated, where authority became hierarchical, where populations were organized into structures that could be taxed, controlled, and mobilized, because dense agricultural output, supported by domesticated animals and stable grain storage, allowed governments to sustain large populations and extract resources efficiently. And those systems created something powerful, because once a state can collect taxes consistently, it can fund armies, build infrastructure, support administrators, and once those systems exist, they reinforce themselves, they expand, they absorb surrounding regions, they compete with neighboring states, and in that competition, they evolve. But here's where something subtle and critical happens, because Europe in particular developed under a very specific set of conditions that created a kind of constant pressure, a pressure that shaped the way its societies evolved over time, because it was not a single unified landmass under one dominant power. It was fragmented, divided by mountains, rivers, and seas, into multiple smaller regions, each capable of forming its own political system, but none easily able to dominate the entire continent. And that created what can only be described as continuous competition. Because when you have multiple states existing close to one another, each with access to similar resources, each capable of interacting, trading, or fighting, survival becomes conditional on keeping up, on adapting, on improving, because falling behind is not theoretical. It means being conquered, absorbed, erased. So over centuries, European states found themselves in a constant cycle of rivalry, war, and innovation, where military advances forced others to respond, where economic changes created new advantages that others had to adopt, where political systems evolved under the pressure of competition. And this pressure shaped everything. It encouraged stronger bureaucracies, more efficient taxation, larger standing armies, better weapons, more organized systems of governance, because the cost of not evolving was extinction. Now compare that to many regions in Africa, not less complex, not less intelligent, but operating under different conditions. Because Africa is vast, much larger than Europe, and its internal geography, deserts, forests, rivers, and disease zones, made large-scale, continuous control across entire regions more difficult, meaning that many African political systems evolved not around controlling every piece of land, but around controlling key routes, trade networks, strategic locations. Empires existed, powerful ones: the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Axum. All of them demonstrate that large-scale organization did develop, that wealth, trade, knowledge, and political complexity existed at high levels. But the structure of that power often looked different, more network-based, more focused on relationships, trade, and influence rather than rigid territorial control. And that difference matters, because it changes the kind of pressure a society experiences. It changes what it optimizes for. It changes what kinds of innovations are necessary. In Europe, constant proximity to rival states meant constant preparation for conflict. In many African regions, distance, environmental barriers, and different forms of organization meant that conflict existed, but often did not create the same relentless cycle of competition across densely packed states. And this leads to another critical factor: writing. Because writing is not just a tool for communication, it is a tool for memory, for preserving knowledge beyond individual lifetimes, for allowing information to accumulate across generations in a structured way. And in regions where writing became deeply integrated into administration, governance, and daily life, it created something incredibly powerful: institutional memory. Because when information is written, it can be stored, copied, transmitted, analyzed, expanded upon. It can survive the death of the person who created it. It can move across space and time. In parts of Europe, especially after the collapse of earlier empires, writing re-emerged as a critical component of state building, records of taxation, legal systems, military organization, trade agreements, all of it documented, all of it preserved, allowing systems to become more complex and more stable over time. And then came something that accelerated this process beyond anything before it: printing. Because once information could be duplicated rapidly, once knowledge could spread at scale, the rate of accumulation changed dramatically. Ideas that once took generations to spread could now move within years, even months, creating a network effect where knowledge builds on knowledge at an accelerating pace. Now look at Africa. Writing existed. Multiple systems existed. From ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs to ge'ez in the Horn of Africa, to Arabic-based systems in West Africa, to manuscript traditions in places like Timbuktu, where scholars produced and preserved knowledge in fields like mathematics, astronomy, medicine. So the idea that Africa lacked writing is false. But the distribution of writing was different. In many regions, knowledge transmission remained primarily oral, passed through generations by memory, by storytelling, by apprenticeship, systems that can be incredibly precise, incredibly rich, but operate differently from written systems. Because oral traditions depend on continuity of people, they depend on living transmission. They don't scale in the same way written systems do. They don't replicate instantly. They don't spread as quickly across large distances. And that difference affects how knowledge accumulates. Because when knowledge moves slowly, innovation compounds slowly. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it spreads differently. And once again, this difference builds over time. Then there's population density. Because the number of people living in a given area affects everything from labour availability to the complexity of social systems. Regions with stable agricultural surplus can support higher population densities, which allows for more specialisation, more complex hierarchies, more structured systems of governance. Parts of Europe reach those densities earlier due to agricultural conditions and domesticated animals. Parts of Africa did as well, in regions where conditions allowed, but large areas, particularly those affected by disease, environmental constraints, or agricultural limitations, maintained lower population densities. And lower density does not mean less sophistication. It often means different strategies, more mobility, more flexibility, more decentralized systems, which can be more resilient in certain conditions. But again, they lead to different outcomes over time. And this brings us to something that is often misunderstood. Different does not mean inferior, because many African societies were not trying to build the same kind of centralized empires that European societies were building. They were solving different problems, operating under different constraints, optimizing for different forms of stability. In some cases, decentralized systems were more effective, more adaptive, better suited to the environment. But when these systems eventually encountered societies that had evolved under constant military competition, under pressures that favored centralization, expansion, and technological acceleration in specific directions, the mismatch became visible, not as a difference in intelligence, but as a difference in trajectory. Because one system had been shaped to compete, to expand, to dominate, and the other had been shaped to adapt, to survive, to balance. And when those two systems finally collided, the consequences were not equal. But to understand how that collision unfolded, you have to look at what happened next. And this is where everything that has been quietly building in the background, geography, animals, climate, agriculture, political structures, suddenly converges into a single moment in history that feels almost inevitable when you look backward, but was anything but inevitable when it was happening. Because for tens of thousands of years, human societies had been developing separately, adapting to their environments, building systems that made sense within their own conditions, and then, in a relatively short window of time, those different paths collided. Not because evolution suddenly changed, not because one group became something fundamentally different, but because of timing. Because by historical accident, certain societies, particularly in parts of Europe, reached a point where multiple layers of accumulated advantages aligned at the same time, where improvements in metallurgy, navigation, shipbuilding, and finance all intersected, creating something new, something powerful, something capable of projecting influence far beyond its original environment. And that projection began at sea, because ships became the bridge between worlds that had remained largely separate for millennia. And when European vessels began moving down the western coast of Africa and across the Atlantic, they were not initially arriving as conquerors. They were arriving as traders, negotiating with existing African states, interacting with established systems, exchanging goods like gold, ivory, spices. At first, it looked like an extension of existing trade networks, but something shifted. Because across the Atlantic in the Americas, European colonies were expanding, and those colonies had land, they had resources, they had crops that could generate enormous wealth. But they lacked one critical element: labour. Because indigenous populations, already weakened by disease, were dying in catastrophic numbers, unable to sustain the demands placed upon them. And so a new system began to form, not all at once, not as a single decision, but as a series of choices that gradually aligned into something devastating. Because European traders began purchasing enslaved people from certain African elites, who themselves were operating within existing systems of conflict and power, where prisoners of war and marginalized individuals could be traded, and at first this was not a global system, it was localized, limited. But then demand increased, and once demand increased, the logic changed. Because the demand for labor in the Americas was not small, it was enormous, constant, expanding, and over time it transformed human beings into commodities on a scale that had never existed before. And once that system gained momentum, it became self-sustaining for centuries. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, and that number does not include those who died before reaching the ships, those who died during the journey, or those who were never counted at all. Entire regions were affected, not just demographically, but structurally. Because when a society begins losing large portions of its population, especially young, productive individuals over long periods of time, the impact is not temporary, it is cumulative. It reshapes everything. Economies shift, political systems adapt, communities reorganize around defense, around survival, around the constant threat of loss. Because when human beings become the primary export, the entire logic of a region begins to change. Conflicts that once had different motivations begin to revolve around capturing people. Trust between communities erodes. Trade networks that once carried knowledge and goods begin carrying something else entirely. And this is what historians refer to when they talk about underdevelopment, not as an absence of progress, but as a reversal, as a redirection. Because development was not simply delayed, it was interrupted, it was extracted, it was diverted. At the same time, across the Atlantic, something else was happening, because the same ships that carried enslaved Africans to the Americas were returning to Europe filled with resources, silver, sugar, tobacco, cotton, materials that flowed into European economies, fueling financial systems, supporting emerging industries, accelerating growth. And this created a feedback loop, because the wealth generated through this system was reinvested into infrastructure, into technology, into expansion, and over time it contributed to something even larger, industrialization, which further widened the gap, not because of a sudden leap in human capability, but because of accumulated advantages, now amplified by extraction. And this is where the story darkens, because what began as uneven development shaped by geography and environment transformed into something more direct, more forceful. Because European societies, now equipped with advanced weapons, ships, and organizational systems began to extend control more aggressively. And by the late 19th century, this expansion reached a new phase: colonialism. Because during events like the Berlin Conference, European powers divided the African continent among themselves, drawing borders that ignored existing cultures, languages, political systems, creating boundaries that reflected external interests rather than internal realities. And this was not a gradual integration. It was an imposition, because existing systems were dismantled, replaced, reshaped to serve a different purpose. Extraction. Resources were taken. Labour was reorganised. Infrastructure were built not to connect African societies internally, but to move goods outward, from mines and fields to ports, from ports to Europe. Local industries were limited. Economic systems were redirected. Education, where it existed, was often designed to support administrative functions rather than independent development. And over time, this created patterns that persisted. Because when economies are structured around exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, when political systems are shaped by external control, when borders divide communities that once interacted differently, the effects do not disappear quickly. They remain. They influence future development. They shape outcomes long after the original systems have ended. But perhaps one of the most enduring effects was not material. It was psychological. Because for such a system to function, it required justification. It required narratives, ideas that framed domination as natural, that portrayed African societies as lacking, as behind, as needing control. And these ideas were not just external. Over time, they influenced internal perceptions as well. Because when generations grow up within systems that devalue their histories, their languages, their identities, those perceptions leave marks. They shape how people see themselves, how they see their past, how they imagine their future. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens. Because if you look only at the last few centuries, it becomes easy to assume that current inequalities reflect something inherent, something natural, something inevitable. But when you expand the timeline, when you look at the full arc of human history, that assumption falls apart. Because for most of human existence, Africa was central. It was where humanity began, where diversity was greatest, where early innovations emerged, where complex societies developed, and what happened later was not a simple continuation. It was a disruption, a redirection, a reconfiguration of global systems under conditions that were anything but neutral. And the most important thing to understand is this: the differences we see today are not the result of different kinds of humans. They are the result of different historical paths. Paths shaped first by geography, then by accumulation, and later by force. And once you see that clearly, the narrative changes. Because what looks like inevitability becomes contingency. What looks like hierarchy becomes history. And what feels fixed reveals itself as something that was built, which means it can also be changed. But to fully understand what that means, we have to look even deeper, not at societies this time, but at the human body itself. And now the story narrows even further because after everything we've uncovered, geography, animals, climate, agriculture, empires, and collision, you're left with something that still feels unresolved, something visible every single day, something your brain notices instantly before you even think about it. And that is the human body itself. Because if all humans share the same origin, the same core abilities, the same evolutionary foundation, then why do we look different at all? Why does skin color vary so dramatically? Why do body shapes change from one region to another? Why does something as basic as appearance seem to divide a species that is, at its core, fundamentally the same? So imagine two people lying side by side, asleep, unaware of anything except the rhythm of their own breathing, one with very dark skin, tightly coiled hair, long limbs, the other with very light skin, straight hair, a more compact build. And if you could freeze that moment and show it to someone from a few hundred years ago, they might tell you that you're looking at two different kinds of humans, two different races, two fundamentally separate categories. But evolution tells a completely different story. Not separate categories, not higher and lower, not better and worse. Just one species, shaped in slightly different ways by different environments over time. Adaptation, not hierarchy. Start with the most obvious feature, the one your brain locks onto immediately: skin color. Because your skin is not a marker of identity in the way we've been taught to think about it, it's not a label, it's not a boundary, it's not even primarily about appearance. It is a biological response to a very specific problem, a balance between two opposing forces that act on the human body every day. On one side, you have the sun, not just light but ultraviolet radiation, something invisible that can damage DNA, burn skin, and destroy a critical nutrient called folate, a nutrient that plays a vital role in reproduction, in fetal development, in the formation of healthy cells, meaning that in environments with intense sunlight, losing too much folate is not a minor issue. It directly affects survival and the ability to pass on genes. On the other side, you have that same sunlight serving a completely different function, because your body uses ultraviolet radiation to produce vitamin D, which is essential for bone health, immune function, and overall physiological stability, meaning that in environments with limited sunlight, especially regions with long winters and low sun angles, not getting enough UV exposure creates a different set of problems, weakening the body in ways that also affect survival. So evolution faced a trade-off. Too much sun creates one problem, too little creates another, and the solution was not to eliminate the problem, but to balance it. That balance is melanin, a molecule produced in your skin that absorbs and disperses ultraviolet radiation, acting as a natural protective layer, and in regions near the equator where sunlight is intense year-round, higher levels of melanin provide protection, reducing damage, preserving folate, stabilizing biological systems under constant exposure. But in regions where sunlight is weaker, where UV radiation is less intense, especially during long winters, that same protection becomes a disadvantage because too much melanin blocks too much UV, reducing the body's ability to produce vitamin D. And over thousands of generations, small differences matter. Individuals whose skin allowed slightly more UV to pass through in low-light environments had a survival advantage, and over time, that advantage accumulated, gradually shifting skin tones. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. And what you end up with is not a hierarchy, not a scale from better to worse, but a spectrum, where different skin tones represent different solutions to the same biological problem. Dark skin is not inferior. Light skin is not superior. Each is optimized for a different environment. And this process is relatively recent in evolutionary terms. The variation you see today, especially very light skin in some regions, developed within the last 10,000 years, a tiny fraction of human history, meaning that what appears deep and fundamental is actually a thin, recent layer on top of a much older shared structure. Now expand beyond skin. Look at the entire body. because patterns emerge there as well. In hotter climates, where the body needs to dissipate heat efficiently, longer limbs and more slender builds increase surface area relative to mass, allowing heat to escape more effectively. In colder climates, where retaining heat is critical, shorter limbs and more compact bodies reduce surface area, conserving warmth and protecting core temperature. These patterns are not random. Some regions had animals that could be controlled, multiplied and integrated into every part of life. Others had animals that resisted, that fought back, that refused to fit into human systems. Some populations lived in climates that allowed food to be stored, surplus to accumulate, and specialization to grow. Others lived in environments where survival demanded constant movement, constant adjustment, constant resilience. And over thousands of years, those small differences didn't stay small. They compounded quietly, relentlessly, until they shaped entire civilizations. And from a distance, looking backward, it became easy to misread those outcomes, to confuse earlier access to certain tools with greater human value, to take differences that were rooted in environment and mistake them for differences in people. But when you trace the story all the way back, past empires, past agriculture, past migrations, you find something else entirely. You find that the real differences were never in intelligence, never in capability, never in potential. They were in starting conditions, in the land, in the climate, in the accidents of nature. And every human being alive today carries the same inheritance, the same ancient origin, the same cognitive foundation, the same ability to learn, to adapt, to create, to destroy, to rebuild, the same species, the same story. What changed were the paths, and those paths were shaped not by superiority, but by circumstance. So when different societies finally encountered each other in the last few centuries, it was not a meeting between different kinds of humans. It was a collision between different histories, different accumulations of advantage and constraint, different timelines that had been unfolding separately for tens of thousands of years. And the outcomes of that collision reshaped the world, not permanently, but powerfully. Because the systems that emerged, the inequalities that formed, the narratives that followed, they were built on top of those earlier differences, amplified by them, justified by them, misunderstood because of them. But here's the part that matters now. If those differences were built, then they are not fixed. If they were shaped by history, then they can be reshaped. Because the same human flexibility that allowed our ancestors to survive deserts, forests, ice ages, and disease, that allowed small groups to spread across an entire planet, that allowed societies to rise, fall, and rise again. That same flexibility still exists in you, in everyone. So as you lie there, maybe with your eyes closing slowly, maybe letting the weight of the day fade, there's something quiet beneath all of this complexity, a simple truth, that beneath every visible difference, beneath every label, every category, every story that has ever tried to divide human beings into something separate, there is only one species, one shared origin, one continuous line stretching back to a small group of humans who stood on the edge of a decision they didn't fully understand. And everything that followed, every civilization, every language, every culture, every difference you can see today, is just the unfolding of that moment under different skies, different climates, different conditions, not separate stories, one story, told in many directions. So tonight, as the world quiets down, imagine it from above, cities glowing in the dark, villages scattered across landscapes, forests, deserts, oceans, mountains, billions of people, all carrying the same ancient inheritance, all shaped in different ways by the places their ancestors lived, not divided, not ranked, just adapted, and still in the deepest sense connected. Rest.